The air in the agency office was the color of old tea and smelled of damp wool and desperation. Beatrice Abbott sat on a hard-backed chair, her spine straight, her hands folded over her worn reticule. She had learned long ago that perfect posture was a kind of armor. It gave the impression of a fortitude she did not always feel around her. Other women shifted and sighed, their hopes rising and falling with the creak of the door. They were all shades of the same predicament, respectable, penniless, and encumbered by the quiet catastrophe of being female with no fortune to recommend them. Beatrice was, by her own quiet assessment, the most precarious of them all. She had been a governess of some repute, known for her patience with difficult children and her impeccable if uninspired instruction. But her last position had ended in a flurry of whispered lies and a dismissal so swift it had felt like an amputation. No reference, no character. In the world of hired gentility, it was a death sentence. The word for a woman with no reference was aine suitable. The word for a woman with no funds was a desperata. Beatrice was both. She had been sitting in this particular purgatory for 3 days, watching women with lesser skills but cleaner histories be called in and placed, while she remained a fixed and silent piece of furniture. Her own dwindling savings were a small, cold knot in her stomach. Soon, desperation would curdle into destitution. The thought was a familiar, unwelcome guest. She had been staring it down for weeks. A harried-looking clerk, Mr. Finch, scanned the room, his eyes skipping over Beatrice, as they had a dozen times before. His Grace's man is growing impatient," he muttered to the woman at the front desk. 6 of them has seen. 6. Found fault with everyone. Too old, too young, too stern, too French. Beatrice allowed herself the smallest, driest flicker of internal amusement. It seemed even dukes could be difficult children. Mr. Finch's gaze circled the room again, this time with a new, frantic energy. It snagged on Beatrice, lingered, and a flicker of calculation crossed his face. He knew her story. He had been the one to receive the damning, referenceless letter from her previous employer. He had looked at her then with a kind of pitying finality, but now he looked at her as a man might look at the last loaf of bread in a famine. He strode over, his shoes squeaking on the dusty floorboards. "A Miss Abbott." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "A Mr. Finch. The Duke of Wycliffe requires a governess immediately, for his estate in the north. It is an unusual situation." Unusual was a word that often meant impossible. Beatrice knew this. I was given to understand my situation was also unusual. Mr. Finch? And that it rendered me ineligible for even the most usual of posts. Her voice was quiet, level, containing no hint of the bitterness that threatened to rise. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. His Grace's solicitor is willing to be flexible. The last 6 governesses did not last the month. They need someone? Urgently. He lowered his voice. The child is a difficult. I am difficult, Beatrice thought. You mean I am the only one left in the room? But she rose, smoothing the gray wool of her skirt. An interview was more than she'd had to hope for, even a hopeless one. She followed him into the cramped office, where a man with the severe, unyielding look of a long-serving lawyer sat behind a desk piled high with papers. He did not look flexible. He looked like a man who enjoyed pointing out the flaws in contracts. He introduced himself as Mr. Sterling and peered at her over his spectacles. Miss Abbott," he began, his voice dry as parchment. I will be plain. Your history is incomplete." My history is what it is, sir," she replied, her chin lifting a fraction. My character, however, is my own." Sterling's eyebrows twitched. He seemed momentarily taken aback by the lack of apology in her tone. The position is at Wycliffe, the Duke's seat. It is remote. The charge is his daughter, Lady Alara. She is 9 years old. She has not spoken a full sentence in nearly a year. She has driven away every woman we have sent. The household is in a state of neglect. The Duke is a man of significant responsibilities and little time for domestic matters. Do you have any experience with elective mutism? I have experience with children in pain, Beatrice said simply. A pain takes many forms. A silence settled in the room, thick with the scent of old paper and dust motes dancing in the single beam of sunlight from a grimy window. Sterling watched her, his head tilted. He was assessing her, not as a woman, but as a tool for a particularly difficult job. He seemed to be weighing her visible composure against her invisible stain. The outer door of the agency opened and closed, followed by the sound of a heavy, confident tread that silenced the low murmurs in the waiting room. A presence filled the building, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Mr. Sterling stiffened, his professional severity cracking, to reveal a sliver of anxiety. The office door opened without a knock. The man who stood there was not so much handsome as he was overwhelming. Tall and broad-shouldered in a perfectly tailored black coat, he seemed to absorb the room's meager light. His face was stark lines and shadows, with a firm mouth and eyes the color of a winter sky. There was an immense stillness about him, the kind that comes from being listened to without ever needing to raise Anna's voice. This was the Duke of Wycliffe. His gaze swept the room, dismissed Sterling with a barely perceptible nod, and landed on Beatrice. It was not a curious look, it was an appraisal, swift and dismissive, like a man judging horseflesh. He noticed things. He noticed the worn shine on the cuff of her dress, the disciplined line of her back, the way her hands were perfectly still in her lap. He noticed, and he filed it all away, under the heading of a governessa. As this the last one, his voice was low, resonant, and utterly devoid of warmth. Your Grace," Sterling stammered, scrambling to his feet. This is Miss Abbott." "I was just—" Have you told her about Alara?" the Duke interrupted, his eyes still on Beatrice. "I was explaining the challenges." The challenges." The Duke repeated the words flat. That my daughter does not speak. My household is in chaos. And I have spent a fortune on a parade of supposedly competent women who fled at the first sign of difficulty. I have trustees to answer to, and a daughter who is vanishing before my eyes. I am out of time and patience." He finally addressed Beatrice directly, though his tone suggested he was speaking to the wall behind her. "I require a governess who will not run. Someone who understands this is a position of employment, not an opportunity for social advancement. The North is cold, the house is isolated, and the child is wounded. The work will be hard and thankless. Do you understand?" Beatrice met that cold, assessing gaze without flinching. "I understand hardship, Your Grace." A flicker of something annoyance, surprise, crossed his features. He was a man accustomed to deference, perhaps even to fear. He was not accustomed to being met as an equal, especially not by a woman in a threadbare dress. "Osterling tells me you come, without a reference, from your last poster." Here it was. "The killing blow." That is correct." Why?" The question was a sharp, hard point. Beatrice held his gaze. The truth was a complex, humiliating story of a lecherous employer and his jealous wife. A story that would sound like a desperate invention. "There was a disagreement regarding the nature of my duties, Your Grace. The lady of the house felt my presence was no longer required. It was the truth, shaved down to its barest, most ambiguous bones. He would read into it what he wished, most did. They imagined theft, or incompetence, or a dalliance with a footman." The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. He was reading her. She could feel it, reading the fine lines of tension around her mouth, the unwavering clarity of her gaze. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. He saw the world as a series of problems to be managed, and she was at this moment a potential, if flawed, solution. He turned to Sterling. "A draw of the contract, a trial period of 3 months. The salary will be double the usual rate." He turned back to Beatrice, his expression unchanged. "You We'll be on the northbound train tomorrow morning. A carriage will meet you at the station. My aunt, Lady Honoria, resides nearby and assists with the household. You will answer to her in domestic matters, but to me alone, regarding my daughter, she. He paused, a muscle tightening in his jaw. I am not looking for a miracle worker, Miss Abbott. I am not looking for a friend for my daughter or a companion for myself. This is not that kind of arrangement. I need a governess, not a wife. The words hung in the air, brutal in their clarity. They were a warning, a boundary. A dismissal of any womanly aspiration she might be presumed to hold. I need a governess, not a wife. The phrase echoed in the quiet space of her mind. It should have been insulting. It was, in its way. But to Beatrice, who had been expecting nothing, it was something else entirely. It was a foundation, a clear, cold, honest transaction. She preferred it to the false politeness and veiled condescension she was used to. She stood. For the first time, she felt a sliver of solid ground beneath her feet. She had nothing to lose, which gave her a strange, unassailable kind of power. Before, I agree, Your Grace, she said, her voice, still quiet, but now edged with steel. The Duke of Wycliffe went utterly still. No one gave the Duke of Wycliffe conditions. Indeed, he said. The word dangerously soft a first, Beatrice stated, ticking the points off on her gloved fingers as if she were outlining a lesson plan. I am to be responsible for Lady Alara. I must have complete authority over the nursery and her education. I will not have my methods questioned or countermanded, not even by your aunt. The Duke's eyes did not leave her face. He gave a curt nod, a go on. A second, while I understand my position, I will not be treated as a common servant by your family or your staff. I expect to be afforded the respect due to my station as your daughter as governess. I will take my meals with my charge, or alone. Not in the kitchens, another nod. Slower this time. He was watching her with an intensity that was no longer dismissive. It was sharp, analytical. He was seeing a person now, not just a solution. And third, as she finished, taking a small breath, you will tell me the truth about your daughter, all of it. I do not bargain with half a story. If I am to help her, I need to know what broke her silence. I will not walk into that house, blind. The silence that followed was profound. Mr. Sterling looked from the Duke to Beatrice and back again, his mouth slightly agape. He had the look of a man watching someone tap on the glass of a tiger's cage. But men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all, and grief makes fools of the cleverest of us. Alexander, Duke of Wycliffe, had spent a decade building walls around his life, his heart, and his home. He had mistaken control for safety and silence for peace. And here was a woman in a faded dress, with nothing to her name but her own integrity, demanding the keys to the most fortified room in his castle. He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw not a desperate spinster, but a woman of formidable composure. He saw the quiet intelligence in her eyes and the unyielding set of her jaw. He had offered her double the salary, and she had countered, not with a request for more money, but with a demand for dignity and truth. It was so unexpected, so entirely outside the realm of his experience with the women who simpered and schemed for his favor, that it broke through his defenses. A long moment passed. Then he spoke, and his voice had lost some of its arctic chill. My wife, Alara's mother, died a year ago. She was a musician. She was teaching Alara the pianoforte. The day she died, Alara was practicing. My aunt, in her grief, said something careless, something connecting the music to my wife's collapse. Alara has not touched the instrument since. She has barely spoken. She believes she is responsible. It was the most he had said on the matter to anyone. The confession was stark, painful, and utterly without self-pity. He had given her the truth. Beatrice felt a pang of something that was not pity, but a deep, resonant empathy. For the silent child, and for the man who had just shown her the jagged edge of his own wound. "A thank you, Your Grace," she said softly. "I accept the position." He simply nodded, the brief, unguarded moment passing as he retreated once more behind his jugal composure. Sterling will finalize the details. Be ready tomorrow. Ah. He turned and was gone, leaving a vacuum in the small dusty room. Mr. Sterling sank back into his chair, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "A good heavens, Miss Abbott," he breathed. "I in all my years and no one. But Beatrice was no longer listening. She was looking out the grimy window at the grey London street, her thoughts already turning northward. To a cold, neglected house, a silent child, and a duke who needed a governess, but who had, without knowing it, just hired something far more dangerous. A woman who saw the truth and was not afraid to speak it. She had a position. She had a purpose. For the first time in a long time, she had a chance. The central image of her future was already forming in her mind. A silent, covered pianoforte, waiting in a cold, dark room, waiting for someone to let the light in. The journey north was a gradual shedding of color. The soft greens of the south bled into the harsher, more dramatic landscapes of the northern counties, all sweeping moors and stark, stony hills under a vast, pale sky. Beatrice watched the world change through the smudged glass of the railway carriage, a book lying unopened in her lap. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was a hypnotic counterpoint to the turmoil of her thoughts. Wycliffe. The name itself sounded like a place of wind and rock. A carriage, as promised, was waiting at the desolate country station. It was a handsome vehicle, but the ducal crest on the door was faded, and the horses, though strong, lacked the glossy sheen of a well-tended London pair. It was the first sign of the neglect the Duke had mentioned. The coachman, a taciturn man with a face weathered like an old map, nodded to her and loaded her single trunk without a word. They drove for another hour, climbing higher into the hills. The air grew colder, sharper, scented with damp earth and the faint, clean smell of distant snow. And then she saw it. Wycliffe was not a house, it was a geological event, a vast, sprawling edifice of grey stone that seemed to have grown directly from the rugged cliffside it commanded. It stared out over the wild, empty landscape with a multitude of dark, unblinking windows, more fortress than home. It was magnificent, intimidating, and profoundly lonely. As the carriage crunched to a halt on the gravel drive, the great oak doors swung open. A butler, stooped and ancient, stood silhouetted against the gloom of the entrance hall. "A Miss Abbott," he intoned, his voice a dry rustle. I am Ames. His Grace is in London on matters of state. He is not expected for a fortnight. Lady Honoria awaits you." A Beatrice stepped out of the carriage and into the hall, and the first thing that struck her was the cold. It was not the crisp cold of the outdoors, but a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the stone walls themselves. The cavernous space was all dark wood and shadows, the soaring ceiling lost in gloom. A grand staircase swept upwards into darkness. There were no flowers, no lit fires in the massive hearths, only the faint dusty smell of a house holding its breath. It was a place frozen in time, a monument to a grief that had never been allowed to thaw. A woman was descending the staircase, her silk skirts whispering against the stone. She was tall and thin, with a duca's sharp features softened by age but hardened by disapproval. Her silver hair was impeccably coiffed, and her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, missed nothing. This was Lady Honoria. "So, you are the latest one," she said, her voice thin and sharp as a needle. She did not offer a hand or a word of welcome. Her eyes raked over Beatrice's plain traveling dress with open disdain. "You look a great deal more serviceable than the last. I trust you understand your duties." "I believe so, my lady," Beatrice replied, her voice even. Good. The child is in the nursery. She will not speak to you. She will not acknowledge you. Your task is to ensure she is fed, clothed, and does not set fire to the draperies. The previous governess, a flighty creature from Batha, believed in the power of expressiona. She was gone in 3 weeks. We do not espressa ourselves at Wycliffe. Miss Abbott, we endure. Lady Honoria's gaze swept the cold, silent hall. This house has known great sorrow. We do not require sentiment. We require ordre templier. The crime was that she had been chosen first. Lady Honoria had been the one to manage the house after the late Duchess's death, the one who had accompanied the grieving child with her careless, poisonous words. She saw herself as the rightful chatelaine of Wycliffe, and Beatrice was an unwelcome usurper of a role she coveted, even a humble one like governess. "I will do my best to provide it," Beatrice said, refusing to be baited. Lady Honoria gave a tight, unpleasant smile. "See that you do. Ames will show you to your room. Dinner is at 7. You will take it in the nursery with the child." She turned and swept away her silk skirts, a sound of crisp dismissal. A young housemaid, with frightened eyes, showed Beatrice to her rooms. They were adjacent to the nursery on the 2nd floor, a small, sparsely furnished bedroom, and a sitting room with a tightly packed bookshelf and a fireplace where no fire was laid. It was clean but cheerless. Through a connecting door was the nursery itself. It was a large, beautiful room, with tall windows that should have been flooded with light, but the heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, plunging the space into a perpetual twilight. Toys were piled in corners untouched. Books sat on shelves, their spines unbroken. And in a high-backed chair by the cold hearth sat a small, thin girl with a cloud of dark hair and her father's solemn, watchful eyes. She was unnervingly still, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. This was Lady Alara. Beatrice did not approach her directly. She moved quietly into the room, setting her small bag down. "A good afternoon, Lady Alara," she said, her voice calm and gentle. My name is Miss Abbott. I am to be your new governess." The child did not move. She did not look up. She gave no sign that she had heard. It was like speaking to a porcelain doll. Beatrice did not press. She had promised patience, and patience was what she would give. She walked over to the tall windows. It is rather dark in here, isn't it?" she remarked to the room at large. With a heave, she pulled back the heavy curtains. Afternoon light, pale but clear, flooded the room, illuminating a universe of dust motes. It fell across the furniture and the pale, still face of the child. Alara flinched, raising a hand to shield her eyes. The first movement Beatrice had seen her make. She did not speak, but she looked up at Beatrice, her dark eyes wide with a kind of startled resentment. Beatrice met her gaze and gave a small, quiet smile. She had done nothing more than open a curtain, but it was a beginning, it was a change. And in a house, frozen by grief, any change was a tremor in the ice. The days at Wycliffe settled into a strange, silent rhythm. Beatrice's life was circumscribed by the nursery and the 2nd-floor corridor. She rose early, took her solitary breakfast, and then entered the hushed world of her charge. Alara remained a silent, watchful presence. She obeyed simple instructions: atto, dress, to eat, to sit at the lesson table with a remote, mechanical compliance. But she would not read, she would not play, and she would not speak. Beatrice did not force her. She read aloud, her voice a quiet, steady presence in the room, filling the silence with tales of adventure and faraway lands. She worked on her own mending, the simple, repetitive motion of needle and thread, a calming influence. She never demanded a response, never asked a direct question that required more than a nod. She simply existed in the space with the child, a constant, undemanding warmth in the cold, still air. Lady Honoria observed her with a hawk-like vigilance, appearing at unexpected moments to inspect the nursery or quiz Beatrice on her lesson plans. She seemed disappointed by Beatrice's quiet competence, by her refusal to be provoked or intimidated. "The child is no better," she would pronounce, a note of satisfaction in her voice. I told my nephew this was a fool's errand. What she needs is discipline, not storybooks. A pediatress would simply nod. A patience is its own kind of discipline, my lady. In the evenings, after Alara was in bed, Beatrice would explore the silent, echoing house. It was a labyrinth of closed-off rooms and dust-sheeted furniture. The air was thick with the past. In the grand, frigid drawing room, she found it. The pianoforte. It was a beautiful instrument, an elegant rosewood grand, but it was shrouded in a heavy Holland cover, and its lid was locked shut. It was not an instrument. It was a tombstone. The heart of the house silenced. Beatrice would stand before it, her hand hovering over the dusty cover, feeling the weight of the sorrow that clung to it. This was the lock she had to pick. The Duke remained in London, a remote, powerful figure whose presence was felt only in the perfect obedience of his staff and the fear in his aunt's eyes. He sent brief, impersonal notes, inquiring after his daughter's health, which Beatrice answered with equally brief, factual reports. A Lady Alara is taking her meals. Tsat. We have begun a study of botany. She did not write of the oppressive silence, or the child's hollow eyes, or the cold that seemed to seep from the very stones of the house. He had not asked for miracles. One rainy afternoon, nearly a month into her tenure, Beatrice was sorting through a dusty chest of old schoolbooks in the nursery. At the very bottom, she found a small, leather-bound volume. It was not a schoolbook. It was a collection of simple English folk songs, the melodies written out in a delicate feminine hand. Tucked inside the cover was a pressed flower, a faded bluebell. This had belonged to the late Duchess. Beatrice sat with the book in her lap for a long time. She did not open it in front of Ilara. Later that day, while Ilara was staring out the window at the rain-streaked landscape, Beatrice began to hum. It was a simple, cheerful melody from the book, a song about a shepherd and a spring morning. She hummed quietly to herself as she tidied the bookshelves. She did not look at Alara, but she felt the shift in the room. The chalice stillness changed. It was no longer vacant. It was attentive. She had turned her head from the window and was watching Beatrice, her expression a mixture of confusion and a faint, ghost-like curiosity. Beatrice finished her task, and the melody faded. She did not mention it. The moment passed. But the next day, as she was reading aloud, Alara put a small hand on her arm, stopping her mid-sentence. The child pointed a single trembling finger towards the book of songs which Beatrice had left on the mantelpiece. Beatrice's heart gave a sudden, sharp leap. She kept her voice perfectly level. Would you like me to hum again, my lady?" Alara stared at her, her dark eyes wide and searching. Then, very slowly, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the first request she had made. The first time she had shown a flicker of will, of desire. It was more precious than any spoken word. Beatrice picked up the book and began to hum the simple tune again, her voice a soft, steady thread of sound, weaving through the silent room. And as she hummed, she saw two large, silent tears trace paths down the child's pale cheeks. Alara did not make a sound, but she was no longer a porcelain doll. She was a little girl who was beginning, just beginning, to feel again. A week later, the Duke came home. His arrival was unannounced. Beatrice was in the nursery reading to Alara when she heard the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel below. A few moments later, the house, usually so silent, was filled with the quiet bustle of aims giving orders and footmen carrying luggage. Alara went rigid in her chair. Her small moment of connection, of feeling, vanished as she retreated back into her shell of silence, her face becoming a pale, blank mask. The sound of her father's voice in the hall below was enough to refreeze the delicate thaw. Later that evening, there was a knock on the nursery door. It was the Duke. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered. He had come straight from his journey, still in his traveling coat. "Miss Abbott," he said, his voice low. He looked past her to his daughter, who was sitting by the window, her back to the room. Has there been any a change? She is listening, your grace. Beatrice said quietly. That is a change. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. As she pointed to a book of songs, Beatrice explained. Her mother's, I believe. She allows me to hum them. She cries, sometimes. Silently, Alexander's gaze went to the small figure of his daughter. A complex expression crossed his face, a mixture of pain, frustration, and a flicker of something else. How perhaps, though he would never have named it as such. He had seen so many governesses fail. So many experts throw up their hands in defeat. This quiet, unassuming woman had been here a month, and had found a crack in the ice that no one else had even seen. He noticed the curtains were open. He noticed the room was clean and orderly, but not sterile. He noticed a vase with a few sprigs of winter heather on the mantelpiece. He noticed the faint scent of beeswax instead of dust. Small things, insignificant things. But they added up to a feeling he had not encountered in this house for a very long time. Care. My aunt informs me you have been exploring the house, he said, his tone shifting back to something more formal. Have, your grace. It helps to walk after the day is done. She mentioned, you spend time in the drawing room. His eyes were sharp. Near the pianoforte. It is a beautiful instrument. Beatrice said simply. It seems a shame for it to be locked away. It is locked for a reason. Miss Abbott. The warning was back in his voice. Cold and clear. I am aware of the reason, your grace. But locks are meant to protect things of value, not to entomb them. He stared at her, the silence stretching between them. She was doing it again, and meeting his ducal authority with her own quiet, unshakable truth. It was infuriating. It was unsettling. And it was, to a part of him he kept firmly buried, strangely compelling. You are overstepping, he said, but the words lacked their usual force. Am I? She asked softly. Am I merely doing the job you hired me for? To reach your daughter, her heart is locked in that room with that instrument, your grace. You cannot heal one without addressing the other. He had no answer for that. He simply stood there for a moment, a powerful man rendered powerless by a grief he did not know how to navigate. Then, with a curt nod, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the long, silent corridor. Beatrice let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had pushed, perhaps too hard, but she had seen the flicker in his eyes. He was listening, too. A few days later, a small, ornate key appeared on the mantelpiece in her sitting room. It was lying on a sheet of his heavy, cream-colored stationery. There was no note, just the key. The key to the pianoforte. Beatrice did not use it. Not yet. She let it sit there for days, a silent promise. One afternoon, she took it with her into the nursery. Ilara's eyes immediately fixed on the small brass object in Beatrice's hand. Her breath hitched. Beatrice said nothing. She simply went about the afternoon's lessons, the key resting on the corner of the table between them. It was a test, a question asked without words. That evening, after Ilara was asleep, Beatrice went down to the drawing room. The vast cold space was lit only by a sliver of moonlight through a gap in the curtains. She walked to the pianoforte, her heart beating a little faster. She lifted the heavy Holland cover, the fabric whispering in the silence. The rosewood gleamed in the dim light. She took the key, her hand trembling slightly, and fitted it into the lock. It turned with a small, stiff click. She lifted the lid. The keys, a stretch of ivory and ebony, lay waiting. They were dusty. She took her handkerchief, and one by one, began to gently wipe them clean. She did not play a single note. She simply tended to the instrument, waking it from its long sleep with a quiet act of care. She did this every night, for a week, cleaning the keys, polishing the wood, letting the air circulate around it, preparing the ground. One afternoon, Ilara, who had been growing steadily more present, more aware, followed Beatrice downstairs on some pretext. She stood in the doorway of the drawing room, watching, as Beatrice gently polished the pianoforte's gleaming surface. Beatrice looked up and smiled. It is a beautiful instrument, is not it? Alara did not answer, but she took a hesitant step into the room, then another. She walked slowly towards the pianoforte, her eyes wide. She stopped beside Beatrice and reached out a small, trembling hand. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a long moment, not quite daring to touch them. Then, with infinite slowness, she rested her index finger on a single ivory key. She did not press it down, she did not make a sound, she just touched it, a connection, a memory, a possibility. And from the doorway, unseen by either of them, the Duke of Wycliffe watched. He had come looking for his aunt, and had been drawn by the unaccustomed sight of the drawing-room doors standing open. He saw his daughter, who had not willingly entered this room in a year, standing by the instrument that was the source of all her pain. He saw her touch it. He saw the governess watching her, not with triumph, but with a quiet, patient tenderness that made his own throat tighten. He had hired a functionary, a tool, to fix a problem. But the woman standing in the moonlight of his cold drawing room was something else entirely. She was not fixing his daughter, she was healing her, and in doing so, she was letting light and air into the sealed-up chambers of his own life. He felt a sudden, sharp, and profoundly unwelcome surge of feeling. It was gratitude, yes, but it was tangled with something more complex, something that felt dangerously like need. He turned and walked away before he could be seen, his mind in turmoil. He had told her he did not need a wife. The joke, he was beginning to realize, was pretending he believed it. The thaw, once begun, deepened with the slow advance of the northern spring. The change in Wycliffe was subtle at first, a series of small surrenders to the light. Beatrice, with a quiet determination that brooked no argument, had the household staff open curtains, air out rooms, and build fires in the long dormant hearths. The house began to breathe again. A Larosse world expanded beyond the nursery. She followed Beatrice through the echoing halls and out into the gardens, where the first green shoots were pushing through the cold earth. She still rarely spoke, but her silence was different now. It was a comfortable, companionable silence, punctuated by small gesture. A hand slipped into Beatrice's, a wildflower, picked and presented as a solemn gift. One evening, as Beatrice sat by the fire in the drawing room, Alara climbed onto the pianoforte bench. She sat for a long time, looking at the keys. Then, she reached out and played a single clear note, C. The sound hung in the air, pure and true. She looked at Beatrice, her eyes wide with a kind of fearful wonder. Beatrice smiled, her heart aching with a fierce, protective tenderness. It is a beautiful sound, isn't it? From that day on, the single note became a ritual, then two notes, then a hesitant fumbling three-note chord. It was not music, not yet. It was the sound of a memory being carefully, painstakingly pieced back together. Alexander watched it all from a distance, caught between relief and a growing, unfamiliar anxiety. The house was changing. His daughter was changing. And the woman responsible for it all was becoming inextricably woven into the fabric of his life. He found himself altering his routines, seeking her out under the guise of discussing Alara's progress. He would find her in the library late at night, a book in her lap, the firelight catching the intelligent planes of her face. Their conversations started with Alara, but soon drifted. She spoke of books, of history, of the surprising resilience of the gardens at Wycliffe. She had opinions, and she stated them plainly, without artifice or any attempt to flatter him. She treated him not as a duke, but as a man. It was unnerving, and he found he liked it more than he should. You have been alone in this for a long time, she said one night, looking up from her book, as he stood by the hearth. The observation was so direct, so lacking in pity, that it caught him off guard. I have had my duty, he said. The words a familiar shield, a duty can be a cold companion. Your Grace, My parents died when I was barely of age," he found himself saying, the words coming out before he could stop them. "And a responsibility I did not understand. My wife, she brought light into this house. When she died, the light went out. I did not know how to bring it back." It was a confession of failure, one he had never voiced to another soul. Perhaps you were not meant to do it alone," Beatrice said softly. He looked at her then, at her calm, steady face, and felt a profound sense of recognition. He was the most powerful man in the county, courted and feared in equal measure, yet he was utterly, achingly lonely. This quiet, overlooked woman saw it. She saw him. Men do not always care to be seen, child, for to be seen is to be known, and to be known is to be vulnerable. But Alexander was beginning to suspect that his fortress of solitude was, in fact, a prison. This growing warmth did not go unnoticed. Lady Honoria watched with an increasingly sour expression. She saw the open curtains, the fires in the grates, the way a Larosse hand now sought out the governess. She saw the late-night conversations between her nephew and the woman she considered little more than an up-jumped servant. Every sign of healing in the house was, to her, a sign of her own diminishing influence. The whispers began. Subtle at first, a poisoned drop here and there among the staff. Such a forward woman, spending so much time with his Grace, one wonders about her intentions. Lady Honoria made it her business to remind everyone of Beatrice's incomplete history. She was planting seeds of doubt, preparing the ground for a battle she intended to win. The threat, when it came, was delivered on a silver tray. One morning, a letter arrived for Lady Honoria. It bore the seal of Beatrice's former employer, the very household from which she had been so unceremoniously dismissed. Honoria read it in the morning room, a thin, triumphant smile playing on her lips. That afternoon, she confronted the Duke in his study. Alexander, we must speak. About the governess. Miss Abbott is performing her duties admirably," he said, not looking up from his ledgers. Her duties seem to extend far beyond the nursery." She said sharply. "I have made inquiries, as I felt it my duty to do. I have received a letter from her former employer, Lady Danbury. She placed the letter on his desk. It seems our Miss Abbott was dismissed for a gross impropriety, and a welcome advance, toward Lord Danbury. She is a fortune hunter, Alexander. A predator. And you have brought her into this house, with your vulnerable daughter." Alexander read the letter. The words were damning, painting a picture of a conniving woman who had used her position to try and entrap a wealthy man. It was a lie. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that it was a lie. The woman he had come to know, the woman who demanded dignity over salary, who tended to his daughter's broken heart with infinite patience, was not in these venomous lines. It was a weapon. And what do you propose I do with this information? Anta, he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Dismiss her, of course. Immediately, before she can do any more damage. People are already talking. It reflects poorly on you, on this family. There is to be a small gathering here next week, the vicar, the local gentry. You cannot have this woman under your roof when they arrive. Think of the scandal, She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. And think of Alara. If it were known you are employing such a persona, questions could be raised about your suitability as a guardian. The courts might see fit to place her with someone more stable, someone with an unblemished reputation. The threat was clear. It was not just about Beatrice's position anymore. It was about his daughter. Lady Honoria was threatening to use this lie to petition for custody of Alara. A cold fury, the likes of which he had not felt in years, settled over Alexander. His aunt was not trying to protect his daughter. She was trying to possess her. And she was willing to destroy an innocent woman to do it. He folded the letter and looked at his aunt, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Honoria. I will handle it. His quiet dismissal unnerved her. She had expected outrage, an immediate summons for the governess. Instead, she was met with a wall of glacial calm. She left the study feeling a prickle of unease, but confident that she had won. The Duke, she knew, would do anything to avoid a scandal, anything to protect his name and his child. He would dismiss the girl. But Alexander did not summon Beatrice. Instead, he wrote 2 letters of his own. One was to his solicitor in London, containing a series of terse, urgent instructions. The other was to a man he knew in the county where the Danburys lived. He sealed them both and sent them off with his fastest rider. Then he went about his days, his manner unchanged, his composure absolute. He watched Beatrice with his daughter, he spoke with her in the evenings, and he gave no sign of the storm that was about to break. He was waiting. And as Beatrice was about to learn, a duca's patience, once deployed, was a far more formidable weapon than a duca's anger. The day of the gathering dawned gray and overcast, the sky pressing down on the moors. Wycliffe, for the first time in over a year, was preparing to entertain. The house was filled with the scent of beeswax and baking bread, and the murmur of staff hurrying to and fro. Beatrice kept Alara in the nursery, away from the disruption, but a sense of anxious energy permeated the entire estate. Lady Honoria was in her element, sweeping through the halls, issuing orders, a general marshalling her troops for a decisive battle. She treated Beatrice with a kind of triumphant condescension, the look of a woman who knows a secret and is savoring the moment of its revelation. You will ensure the child remains upstairs and unseen, Miss Abbott, she commanded. We cannot have her unpredictable silences, casting a pall over the afternoon. And you of course will remain with her. Of course, my lady, Beatrice said, her expression serene. She knew something was wrong. She could feel it in the air, in the way Lady Honoria looked at her, in the sudden, watchful distance of the Duke. He had been polite, but remote, for days. The brief warmth of their evening conversations extinguished. She felt a familiar chill of precariousness return. She had allowed herself to hope, to feel safe. A foolish mistake. By 3 o'clock, the guests had arrived. Carriages filled the drive. The low murmur of conversation and the clink of teacups drifted up from the drawing-room below. Beatrice sat with Alara by the nursery window, reading aloud, her voice a calm counterpoint to the nervous flutter in her own chest. Suddenly, Alara put a hand on the book. There in the drawing-room, she whispered, her first unsolicited full sentence in a year. Her voice was rusty, unused. Beatricia's heart stopped. She looked at the child, whose eyes were fixed on the door, a look of intense anxiety on her face. Yes, they are, Aunt Honoria said. She said Mama's pianoforte is for show. That no one should touch it. Your aunt is mistaken, Beatrice said gently. It is for music. A commotion from downstairs interrupted them. A servant, a young footman with wide, panicked eyes, appeared at the nursery door. Miss Abbott, His Grace Lady Honoria, they request your presence in the drawing-room. Ice flowed through Beatrice's veins, a summons. A public summons. This was it. The axe was about to fall. She stood smoothing her simple gray dress. Very well. She looked at Alara, whose face was pale with fear. Stay here. I will be back shortly. She walked down the grand staircase, each step an act of will. The murmur of conversation in the drawing-room ceased the moment she appeared in the doorway. 20 pairs of eyes of the vicar, the local squire, their wives and daughters all turned to look at her. The room was a tableau of startled faces. The Duke stood by the fireplace, his face carved from granite. Lady Honoria stood near the center of the room, her expression one of righteous fury. She was holding a letter. Miss Abbott. Lady Honoria set her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. How good of you to join us. I am afraid we have a rather unpleasant matter to discuss. Beatrice walked further into the room, her head held high. She would not be cowed. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She stopped before them, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. You wished to see me, my lady, I did. Honoria said, her eyes gleaming with malice. I have been forced to inform my nephew, and now must inform our friends and neighbors about the true nature of the woman he has so unwisely installed in this house. I have here a letter from your former employer, Lady Danbury G. She held it up for all to see, yet details, in quite shocking terms, your dismissal for attempting to compromise her husband, for gross impropriety. You are, it seems, a woman of no character whatsoever. A collective gasp went through the room. The guests stared at Beatrice, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock and condemnation. She was being tried and convicted in a matter of seconds. A lie that originally ruined her, now resurfacing. The words were a death knell. She was ruined. Again. Publicly, this time. She looked at the Duke, expecting to see cold dismissal in his eyes. Instead, she saw nothing. His face was a perfect, impenetrable mask. He was letting this happen. Do you deny it, Miss Abbott? Lady Honoria pressed, savoring her victory. Beatrice met her gaze. I deny that I am a woman of no character, my lady. Her voice did not tremble. As for the contents of that letter, they are a falsehood. But I have no means to prove it. Of course you don't. Honoria sneered. Women of your sort never do. She turned to the Duke. Alexander, you must see. She must be dismissed. For the good of this family, a child cannot be raised by an adventuress. If you will not provide a suitable environment, I will be forced to petition the courts to see that she has one. A threat hung in the air, final and absolute. The room held its breath. And then, a sound. Faint at first, then clearer. A simple, hesitant melody, played on a pianoforte. It was the folk song Beatrice had hummed in the nursery. The shepherd and the spring morning. Every head turned towards the sound. The music stopped, and from the shadows near the great instrument, Alara emerged. She was pale but resolute. She walked, not to her father, but directly to Beatrice, and took her hand. Her small fingers curled tightly around Beatrice. She turned to face her great-aunt, her dark eyes blazing with a child's pure, unwavering fire. You lied, she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing through the stunned silence of the room. You told me my music made Mama sick. You told me I hurt her. She took a breath, her small chest heaving. But she loved my music. She loved it. It was an accusation, an exorcism, and a declaration of allegiance all in one. The room was utterly still. Lady Honoria stared at the child, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Her carefully constructed narrative had just been shattered by the one person she had thought was a broken, silent pawn. The spell was broken. Alexander moved. He stepped forward, taking a document from his coat pocket. He did not look at his aunt. He addressed the room. It seems we are in the business of revealing truths this afternoon, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. My aunt is correct that Miss Abbott was dismissed from her last post. However, the reason she has provided is, as Miss Abbott stated, a falsehood. He unfolded the paper. This is a sworn affidavit from the housekeeper of the Danbury estate, a Mrs. Gable, a woman of 40 years of service. She testifies that Lord Danbury made persistent and unwanted advances toward Miss Abbott. When Miss Abbott rebuffed him and threatened to inform his wife, Lord Danbury panicked. He and his wife conspired to invent a story and dismiss her, without a reference to ensure her silence. He looked directly at Beatrice, and for the first time, she saw the cold fury in his eyes was not for her. It was for her accusers. The crime was not her impropriety, but her integrity. He then turned his gaze on his aunt, and the temperature in the room dropped by 20 degrees. You, madam, have known of my daughter's pain for a year. You knew its cause, for you were its cause, and instead of helping her, you used her silence as a weapon. You have brought a lie into my house, to slander an innocent woman, and to threaten my hold on my own child. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Cruelty seems already abundant this evening. I see no reason to add mine. You will pack your things. A carriage will be ready in an hour. You will not be welcome at Wycliffe again. A Lady Honoria's face had gone from triumphant to ashen. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had been utterly, publicly vanquished. The eyes of her friends and neighbors were now on her, filled with a horrified, fascinated pity. She had been rendered irrelevant. Without another word, she turned and fled the room. The guests stood in awkward, stunned silence. The drama was over. The Duke looked at them, his expression making it clear the gathering was at an end. They began to murmur their excuses, collecting their wraps and making hasty, quiet exits. In the suddenly cavernous room, only 3 people remained: the Duke, the Governess, and the child who stood between them, still clutching Beatrice's hand. Beatrice looked down at Alara, her heart too full for words. She had not been dismissed. She had been defended, vindicated, chosen. She looked up at the Duke. Your Grace," she started, but her voice failed her. He looked at his daughter, then at her. "It seems I owe you an apology, Miss Abbott," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "And my thanks." Beatrice simply shook her head, unable to speak. She knelt and wrapped her arms around Alara, burying her face in the child's dark hair. Alara's arms came up and circled her neck in a fierce, tight hug. She stayed. She had been tested, and she had stayed. And in the end, it was not the Duke who had saved her, it was the child. They had saved each other. Later that night, the house was quieter than it had been in years. The guests were gone. Lady Honoria was gone. A strange, fragile peace had settled over Wycliffe. A fire crackled in the drawing-room hearth, casting a warm, dancing light on the walls. The pianoforte stood open, no longer a tomb, but an invitation. Beatrice stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a familiar uncertainty. The battle was won, but what now? Her position was secure, but it was still just that. A position. She heard footsteps and turned. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching her. He had shed his formal coat and looked younger, less formidable, in his shirt sleeves. "I could not find you," he said. "I was just thinking." He walked into the room and came to stand beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the moonlight on the moors. What I did today," he began, his voice low and hesitant. Was not just for Alara." Beatrice's heart began to beat a little faster. She kept her eyes on the view outside. "I know, I was wrong," he said. The words stark in the quiet room. When we first met. What I said to you. Odd, eh?" She turned to face him. You said you needed a governess, not a wife." "I was a fool," he said, his gaze intense, searching her face in the firelight. "A blind, arrogant fool. I built walls around this house and around my life, and I thought that would keep us safe. I thought silence was peace, but this house has not been at peace. Ida's been a tomb. My daughter has been a ghost in it. And I have been its keeper." He took a step closer and then you came. You walked into this cold, silent place, and you were not afraid of it. You did not try to flatter me or charm my daughter. You just were. You were patient, and you were honest, and you were kind. You opened the curtains. You taught my daughter that her own heart was not a weapon. You brought this house back to life. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were warm and strong around hers. Beatrice, I am not talking about gratitude." "Do not say it if it is only gratitude I want," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I am talking about the fact that for 10 years I have been the Duke of Wycliffe, a title, a set of duties, a responsibility. And tonight, watching you with Alara, I realized I did not want to be a duke. I just wanted to be a man. Her father and your husband, The word hung between them, shimmering and impossible. "I need you, Beatrice," he said, his voice raw with a vulnerability that stripped away every last vestige of his rank. Not as a governess. Not as a solution to a problem. "I need you." 8 years, she had held back all day, all year, finally spilled over. Tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a profound earth-shattering relief. To be seen, to be wanted. Not for her usefulness, but for herself. Alexander," she breathed. The first time she had ever used his name, he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. A gesture of such aching tenderness that it undid her completely. He looked up, his eyes dark with a decade of unspoken loneliness. "I did not expect to care whether you stayed," he confessed. Now, I cannot imagine this house without you." He framed her face with his hands, his touch gentle, questioning. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender, and then he kissed her. It was not a practiced, suave kiss. It was clumsy and honest and desperate. It was the kiss of a man coming home after a long, cold journey. It was the kiss of a man who had been starving and had just been offered bread. She kissed him back with all the pent-up hope and fear and longing in her own heart. The transaction was over. The bargain was null and void. This was something else entirely, something real. Months passed. The northern spring gave way to a brief, glorious summer. The moors bloomed with purple heather, and the sun, once a stranger, now streamed through the open windows of Wycliffe. The house was filled with sound, the chatter of the staff, the distant laughter of a child, and most days, the clear, confident notes of a pianoforte. Beatrice, no longer Miss Abbott, but the Duchess of Wycliffea, sat beside Alara on the bench, her hand resting on the girlish shoulder. Alara's fingers, once so hesitant, now danced over the keys, filling the drawing room with a Mozart sonata. The music was bright and clean and full of life. The late Duchess's portrait still hung in its place of honor over the mantelpiece. Beatrice had insisted on it. The memory was not to be erased, but honored. She was not a replacement, she was a continuation. She had not come to fill a space, but to help them build something new alongside it. Alexander entered the room, his riding boots silent on the new carpets. He did not interrupt the music. He came to stand behind the bench, placing his hands on his wife's shoulders. He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her hair. She tilted her head back and smiled up at him, a smile of such deep, uncomplicated happiness that it still made his heart ache. Alara finished the piece with a final triumphant chord. She looked up, her face glowing. Did you hear, Papa? I learned the whole thing." "I heard," Alexander said, his voice thick. It was beautiful. Your mother would have been so proud." Alara's smile did not falter. The ghost had been laid to rest. Later that evening, as Beatrice was tucking her into bed, the girl wrapped her arms around her neck. "A good night, Mama," she whispered against her shoulder. The word, spoken so simply, so naturally, was the final, perfect note in the symphony of their new life. Beatrice held her tight, her eyes closing against a wave of pure joy. Later, she and Alexander stood on the terrace, watching the stars prick the vast dark sky. The air was cool and clean. "Are you happy, Beatrice?" he asked, his arm warm around her waist. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I am more than happy," she said. "I am home." He had hired her to be a functionary, a temporary fix for a broken part of his life. He had drawn a line, a contract, a cold and practical boundary, but she had crossed it, not with ambition or design, but with quiet courage and a persistent, gentle kindness. She had not sought to be a duchess. She had simply sought to be a comfort, and, in the end, in that cold, silent house, that was the thing they had all needed most. She became the woman who taught a father how to feel, a daughter how to speak, and a house how to live again. She became the woman who stayed,